Advocates for additional early childhood education funding are continuing to push a proposal that would tap more revenue from the Land Grant Permanent Fund. But now Land Commissioner Ray Powell is floating another idea. The state should acquire more federal land and develop it. More than 40% of land in New Mexico is owned by the federal government, as a reminder. And Mr. Powell's idea is to create a new sustainable funding stream for early childhood education by acquiring some of the 1 million acres designated as disposable land. We'll talk about that in a second. By the feds and find ways to create revenue. He plans to push the idea in the legislative session, but some critics say it's unrealistic and it could take too long to get the results New Mexico needs right now. Joining us to talk about this and other news of the week is one of our line regulars, Rob Nicoleski, the New Mexico Watchdog. Another regular, Tom Garrity of the Garrity Group, is here as well. Returning to the table this week is our regular Laura Sanchez, CEO of the New Mexico Green Chamber of Commerce. And we're very pleased to bring back Antoinette Seguidilla-Lopez, law professor at the University of New Mexico. Now, Rob, you wrote about this a little bit ago, this idea that's kind of going around the West. We're not the only state to think about this. We have a lot of federal land. Could be something could be better done with it. But let's get right to the point here. Early childhood education is the goal. And the mechanism here is to either develop land that's close to urban areas, or if they're not urban areas, do something else with it. Grazing, oil and gas, whatever the case may be. The idea that this could bring a separate revenue source to solve our problems for early childhood education, does that strike you as a reasonable idea? Is there going to be enough money, first of all, to do this?
Well, I think that we should give some kudos to Mr. Powell for coming up with this idea, because it's an idea that has been floated around. In fact, Yvette Harrell, Republican representative from the Alamogordo area, brought it up, and she co-sponsored a bill with Richard Martinez, a Democrat from the Espanola area. I think it's definitely worth thinking about and definitely worth discussing. Now, some of the critics say, well, this is going to take too many. There's too many hurdles in front of it. But even if you wanted to tap, let's say you wanted to tap the Land Grant Permanent Fund, even if you did that, that would take time. You'd have to clear a lot of hurdles with that as well. I don't see anything wrong with discussing this issue. You can argue whether or not the early childhood plan is a good one or not, but at least it's something that gets us off the dime.
Sure. Let's take the urban portion first of this, Laura, rather than the other parts of the state. Las Cruces was mentioned, near Socorro was mentioned. There were some opportunities there. But we've got an interesting example right south of Albuquerque with Mesa del Sol. That was a previous land commissioner deal for us here, but that hasn't quite worked out quite well. Should we take any clues from Mesa del Sol for Mr. Powell's idea, or is that just a separate deal altogether?
Well, I think it's one of the first of its kind, and I think it's important to learn from that deal in terms of how it's worked, but it's also a very young opportunity. I guess it's one that's still in development. I mean, meaning that we really haven't seen the total effects of it, and I don't think in general a lot of what has been promised with Mesa del Sol has come to fruition yet. So I think we have to take a wait and see approach and see how that deal translates into actual benefit for the state. But I think we can probably see similar situations coming up in places like Las Cruces or Socorro if we have the same kind of structure to a deal like Mesa del Sol was. And I think one of the concerns for from the State Land Office perspective, the current State Land Commissioner, is that it was sort of a sweetheart deal that was a part of it because there was a land swap that didn't seem to make as much sense for the state benefit. So the land that was swapped, and I think that's an issue that's important that you have to consider in what the commissioner's saying, because some of it could involve land swaps with the federal government. There's a lot of land right now under the BLM's control management, and these disposal lands, we have to be clear that it doesn't mean that they don't have value. It means that they don't fit the mission of BLM as an agency and the work that they do. So I think it's important to remember that some of these lands could also be developed for renewable energy, for example. A lot of renewable energy projects need a large land footprint, so there could be that possibility. It could be grazing, it could be recreation. There's other types of uses, so I think it's worth looking at it. But I think that the State Land Office doesn't necessarily have a lot of appraisers that are part of their. I mean, they have a limited number of staff. So I think that's a big challenge he's going to have to overcome.
That was part of former Land Commissioner Jim Baca's pushback a little bit. He's not crazy about Mr. Powell's idea. He also mentioned water. But as far as economic development is concerned, kind of get away from early childhood education, but one has to happen before the other. You have to have the economic development to get the money to put into early childhood education. Let's start there. It's an interesting idea, this stuff that abuts urban areas. Manufacturing. My man right here mentioned this a couple of weeks ago in another economic development conversation. What's the matter with having land near an urban area that could potentially be grown into a manufacturing area? Could be an interesting idea.
I think it is an interesting idea, and I think what he's doing, obviously it's not going to solve our current problems.
Sure.
He's just kind of trying to put an idea out there that's going to take quite a while. I don't see any money coming in for at least 10 years.
Yeah.
And that's if everything happened
Yeah.
that's supposed to happen in his plan. Because and as I said before, I think I'm very intrigued that he thinks he has the political skill to pull this off, because it takes a lot.
Meaning he would need the help of the delegation.
He'd need the help of the delegation,
Sure.
he'd need the work of the legislature, he'd need cooperation from the governor's office. And it would take a lot
Right.
to do what he suggests. And that's exciting,
Sure.
but it's also a challenge.
You know, Tom, it's interesting to me that someone's trying to figure out something for education that's outside of the permanent fund, because we seem to have hit a stopping point on wrestle money out of the permanent fund or not. So now the idea is to go around it. You know, so my question there is that a viable way to get? Why can't we just make our push for the permanent fund, or is that just a dead duck at this point?
Well, I think that fight was fought in the past, and you know, all sides I think realize that perhaps, you know, it's like the issue on immigration. You know, you just keep going back, expecting a different result using the same strategies. And so, you know, Commissioner Powell is talking about not slicing up the pie additionally, but growing the pie. And you know, the long-term foresight in trying to get this done, whether it takes 5 years or 10 years, is, I think it's really strong. Because you know, we never know what's going to happen at the federal level, and so if we can actually take control of some of those lands, meaning the state of New Mexico, and then use them to generate some estimates as low as 10 to 20 million, some estimates as high as 50 million, that's potential revenue that could help either education, healthcare, transportation, whatever the priorities are 10 years from now. So you know, I really like the whole concept as a whole. To touch on Laura's comments about Mesa del Sol, you know, Ray Powell Jr. Was the one who came up with the whole concept, and then you know, Jim Baca was in as land commissioner, and then Pat Lyons, and the concept of Mesa del Sol has changed tremendously from when Commissioner Powell was in office the first time. So you know, I think he would love to, you know, see if he could turn back the hands of time, but he can't. And so I don't think we can necessarily look at Mesa del Sol today and say, well, was it a success or a failure? Because it's changed so much.
Sure, it is long term, as Laura mentioned too. Rob, you know, there's a process to this. What the land commissioner wants to do is go to the legislature, ask for some money to do a feasibility study, a good amount of money as a matter of fact, to look at this. It gets to Antoinette's point that this is not going to happen by February. Do you know what I mean? It's just really a long-term thing.
And also Representative Harrell, who had her own plan for transferring some of these public lands, that's what she's asking for as well. A study committee to at least thresh this issue out. So a little bit of history here too, because just about every state east of the Mississippi used to have these situations where you had lots of federal tracts of land, but then eventually they reverted over to the states. But here west of the Mississippi, especially in the Southwest, we have large tracts of land, and that reversion has not happened. And it's not like the federal government's been overseeing this land and taking great care of it. A lot of it's just left to go to seed.
Sure.
So one thing I will add though is, you know, New Mexico, we have what I like about this idea, just at least in terms of growing the pie, is that you know, it's looking at ways to have better use of this land than what's currently you know, on the BLM's at least outlook. So for them, disposing of these lands means being able to manage other areas that they have that are part of their mission. And we're trying to figure out how to make economic use of this land, which could bring additional economic development for the local municipalities, and that would be huge for some of these economies. And for example, today, you know, sort of to give a little bit of a thumbs up to our federal delegation, who I think is going to be really important to this whole discussion. I'm glad that the commissioner is working closely with them. But just today, as of the taping, I guess this will air tomorrow, but there's an announcement that the Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks could be a national monument. So there's actually a federal bill that got drafted and introduced today by both senators, and I know that they worked with the State Land Commission to try to figure out which, you know, how those lines should be drawn to include certain lands that could be either state or federal, and that's a huge part of economic development for areas like Doña Ana County.
I'd agree with that. That's interesting. A lot of constituencies to be dealt with here. It's going to be very, very interesting. I'm going to hold you the internet. We need to move on, but in a moment we're back to talk about Main Street communities and economic development.